Hey everyone, thank you so much for tuning in today. My name is Cassie Riva. I'm the events coordinator at an Unlikely Story bookstore. Before I introduce Tony, I wanted to go over a few technical points. If you have any issues with video or audio quality, click on the help button in the upper right corner of your screen and follow the prompts. For any unresolvable issues, leave the presentation and log back in to see if the problem corrects itself. Any questions can be written in the question and answer box below the screen. If you'd like to buy the book, there's a button in the lower middle part of the screen that will take you directly to our webpage. When you purchase Tony's new book with us, we're going to send you a really cool signed bookplate. With that said, I am thrilled to introduce #1 New York Times bestselling author and illustrator Tony DiTerlizzi, who just released his middle grade sequel to Kenny and the Dragon, Kenny and the Book of Beasts. Kenny Rabbit and Gran the Dragon are on another hair-raising adventure, but this time the stakes are higher. It's a magical journey that you're going to want to read in one sitting. Along with the Kenny series, Tony has created books for 20 years, including Jimmy Zhang Wao's Out of This World Moon Pie Adventure, Caldecott Honor Book, The Spider and the Fly, the Wandla Trilogy, and most famously, the Spiderwick Chronicles with Holly Black, which has sold millions of copies around the world and was adapted into a feature film. Tony is known for his gorgeous and detailed illustrations and was featured in the Norman Rockwell Museum's retrospective Never Abandon Imagination, which featured artwork from the beginning of Tony's career as a contributing artist for Dungeons & Dragons and broke attendance records. Interviewing Tony DiTerlizzi today is best-selling author of the Diary of a Wimpy Kid series and owner of an Unlikely Story bookstore, Jeff Kinney. Tony and Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today.
What an awesome introduction.
That was awesome. And I feel very small right now because I didn't know about all those honors and the record-breaking attendance and all that. So thanks a lot. That's how we're starting.
Listen, they can say Jeff Kinney, Wimpy Kid, and then the next 3 words are Macy's Day Balloon, and it's like, that's it, man. That's it, my friend. That's so amazing. Thank you so much. I mean, listen, you and I have known each other for a while, which, so I'm very excited. I was very excited for this event to begin with, but also the fact that you kind of did what I always dreamed about, which was to make a new bookstore for families. And I love your store. You know that. We've been out many times. It's a beautiful space. And I really think it's amazing what you've created in Plainville. And it's awesome.
Oh, thank you very much.
To be a part of it.
Yeah, I feel lucky to know you. I feel like Spiderwick hit right before Diary of a Wimpy Kid. I felt like I was kind of coming up in your shadow, and it was really cool to see everything that happened for you, and I'm glad to call you a friend.
Oh,
so, are you ready to talk about your new book, Kenny and the Book of Beasts?
Certainly. What do you got?
Very salesy here. So actually, I read both. I love them. Now, I consider reading to be listening. So I listened to Alan Cummings read the books to me.
Oh, fantastic.
And it was interesting because I got to listen to your words, and I didn't without the benefit of the pictures. And then I went back and looked at all of the pictures. I'm amazed by his acting and your writing. Do you realize I've never read your writing because I read the Spiderwick books, right?
Yeah.
And I know you, Holly, put the words to your pictures there, to your idea. But I was really, I know you're a smart guy, but I was just really impressed, and you really took me away to a place that I didn't know that you had in your head, and I just thought that was really cool, and I wanted to say that before we got started. But before we get started with that, can you tell me how you got started? Because here, Kenny and Graham are there. They didn't start off as your ideas. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes, that's right. It's interesting, Jeff, because Kenny and the Dragon came right in that exciting maelstrom of Spiderwick, like all that was going on. And I think, I had written a few picture books prior to Spiderwick, and you're right. I mean, even though Holly and I had plotted those Spiderwick books together, at the end of the day, Holly was the writer on those. She was the one writing those stories, and I felt like maybe I could write something longer format especially because I felt like it was more. It came easier to me than writing picture books. And picture books, I feel like, are really, really difficult to write. They're almost like good poem or a good lyric, right? I mean, I feel to really get that right mix of words and pictures is a real tough balancing act. And I as you can tell by this wordy answer, I tend to rattle on. So Simon & Schuster, the publishers of Spiderwick, knew I was a tremendous fan of classic books like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Peter Pan and The Wonderful Wizard of Oz and things like that. And because those books are in public domain, they offered some of those books to me as a project to possibly illustrate.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, what was it? Dave Barry's Peter and the Star Chasers? Was it Dave Barry and what's the other fellow's name? You know who I'm talking about. Ridley Pearson. Yeah. Was it Ridley Pearson? You know, those were really huge also at the time. So they were thinking about like what other, you know, old classic can we re-jump? And I'm a huge fan of all those of Alice and Peter Pan and Wonderful Wizard of Oz. They're certainly part of why I do what I do. And I remember being at a convention and it's so funny how certain conversations remain with you, and then there's other stuff I can't seem to remember at all. But I remember very specifically talking to Brian Selznick about it, the author and illustrator of Invention of Hugo Cabret, and who's won the Caldecott many times. And Brian said, you know, I could see why you'd want to do that, but that you're never gonna be Sir John Tenniel, who illustrated Alice in Wonderland. You're never gonna be W.W. Denslow, who illustrated Wonderful Wizard of Oz. It's our job to write the new versions of those stories. And that, you know, that had a huge impact on me, but I still felt at that time that I didn't have the ability to write it just myself. So we talked about classics, and one of the classics that I still remembered was this one, actually, I have it handy, was The Reluctant Dragon by Kenneth Graham. And it's actually, this is the little solo version, but it was part of an anthology originally called Golden Dream Days. It's called Dream Days. And The Reluctant Dragon was just a short story in there. But I loved this book. I had this version when I was a kid. And it was illustrated by Ernest Shepard, who had illustrated the Winnie the Pooh books. Yeah. And most people may know Kenneth Graham as the author of The Wind in the Willows. Yeah. And so my editor at the time and we talked a lot about this. And he was like, well, what is it about this story that you like so much? And I was like, everyone is misunderstood. And that resonated with me when I was a kid. Yeah. And I felt like it still resonates to this day. And that's, you know, so I wanted to do like a new version of that theme, that story.
Yeah. And can you tell everybody who's not familiar with the story, tell us about Graham the Dragon. How is he different than what you might have thought a dragon could be?
Right. I mean, that's the whole thing of the story is you have a young rabbit named Kenny Rabbit, who lives on a farm, and this dragon shows up, and he goes to an old bestiary, which is like a medieval tome that describes all the animals that people thought to exist in the world. And in those old medieval bestiaries, you'd see unicorns and dragons and griffins alongside, you know, giraffes and elephants, etc. And he reads that dragons are dangerous, they're fire-breathing, they're bloodthirsty, and he goes up on to go visit this dragon, to go see this dragon with his own eyes, and realizes this dragon likes painting sunsets, poetry, reenacting his favorite scenes and plays, and eating, but not eating rabbits or anything, you know, dessert. All he wants is like creme brulee. And so Kenny starts to realize that that he's judged a book by its cover, literally, and no sooner does he figure this out and start to become friends with this dragon than the townspeople catch wind that there's a dragon. They want the dragon killed, and Kenny's one of his dearest old friends, George, who owns the bookshop, turns out to be a retired knight who's been called into service to, you know, exterminate the dragon.
Right. Now, speaking of dragons, I heard a funny story from your wife, and you'll have to tell me if this is true. I heard that when that you were watching Game of Thrones, and when they finally showed the dragons, I guess it must have been at the end of season 1, that you were standing up and cheering and saying, yes, yes. Is that true, first of all? And what was going through your mind?
Okay, so it wasn't season 1, because they were just little babies. They were like lizards at that point.
Yeah.
I think it was season 7 when you saw the full-blown dragons attack the Lannister army for the first time. It's that really vicious battle where Danny's riding and they're just blowing everything up, and the guys are getting in position, and they're flame goes by, and then they're just piles of ash. So I get up. Now, Sophia, our daughter, is asleep, right? Because obviously I watch this show with her. So I'm like this in front of the television, like it's the Super Bowl, And she was like, but I couldn't yell too loud because I didn't want to wake her up. So it was just like, oh, like it was really funny. And Ange was like, you were never like a sports guy, but I got a glimpse of what that would be like to see you at a Pats game.
So, but what about the psychology of that? Is it the way that I read it when your wife told me the story was that you were almost like that you believed that you had never gotten to see a dragon yet, and that you were finally seeing like a real dragon. Is that how you were experiencing it, or were you just like, oh, good special effects?
I think it's honestly, it's funny you say that because I haven't thought about that, but I suspect it was a combination of that comeuppance on the Lannisters because they're so smug and you wanted to see them get knocked down a peg, and then you see the dragons in digital, in these digital effects to their fullest rendering ability, and they're doing amazing things. And probably the last time I'd seen that was when I saw Dragon Slayer when we were kids.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, we just got one of those arcade games, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but I have Dragon's Lair, the game.
Nice.
Yeah,
nice.
We'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah.
So I was curious. So you made the decision actually to turn the human characters in the original book into animals. So Kenny is a rabbit, and my computer's trying to update. That's funny. So Kenny is a rabbit, and I was curious to know, and it gives it a warmth. I think I read in an interview, you said you wanted this book to be like a warm cup of tea, which I thought was really great. And you can see the color, you get that sense. It's very cool, very whimsical. And I was wondering, you as an artist, when you see a human being, do you automatically transform them into an animal in your mind? Like, I'm really afraid to know what kind of animal you would see me as. But I'd like to know if you see yourself as an animal.
Wow, I'm back. Well, I'm just thinking. I know why I did it because you've written The Wind in the Willows, and I didn't want. It was one of the problems, frankly, we struggled with Spiderwick.
Yeah,
was we didn't want it to be a certain type of human. If that makes any sense, we wanted him to be like an any human. We wanted him to be an every human. Those stories, they're fairy tales with they're adventures, they're escapism. They're not about so much the social injustices in the world. They're not talking about that. But yet you're facing that as a creator when you're trying to like, all right, what will my protagonist look like, whom I'm going to draw? And I felt that with talking animals, at least the books that I remember that I love, like Watership Down, which I read in middle school right after The Hobbit, I was like, you can actually tell a talking animal story and actually really explore a lot of philosophical themes and some heady stuff. And maybe as a young reader, I know that when I was thinking about things that happened in Watership Down, things that happened even in The Hobbit to some extent, because you're still dealing with fantastical elves and dwarves and things, it almost gave me a safe space to think about things that perhaps paralleled what was going on in my world or what I heard my parents talking about. And so I don't normally look at people and think of what their animal is or their avatar animal version is. But I know that with this book, it was pretty quick. It was either he's going to be a mouse, like something very small, or he's going to be a little bit bigger. And the only reason he wasn't a mouse was just because the scale would have been just so ridiculous. Yeah. Already tough enough. And again, I think of, I try to think of these books. I don't know if you do this, but I try to think of like, if I could describe the takeaway in like one sentence, like what is it? What is it? What is the thing I could take away from that story, and what does it mean to me? And I remember in middle school, I was kind of a reluctant reader, and then actually Dungeons and Dragons was like my gateway to reading again. It really reawakened a lot of reading for me, and also turned me into a fantasy lover. And I remember having a conversation with my mom about The Hobbit, because I had read The Hobbit, and as an adult, I'll read it every like 5-6 years. I don't know if you have a book like that you go back to time and again just to see if you get something different out of it.
Yeah, I mostly just read my own, so.
Proofing and copy editing. I was having a conversation with my mom. I was like, I've never quite figured out what exactly the takeaway is for The Hobbit. I mean, I get it. I know what it is. And she goes, I can't believe you don't see it. She's like, the smallest of us can make a difference.
Yeah.
And that stuck with me when I did the first Kenny book and when I did the new Kenny book. That idea of the smallest of us can make a difference. Really something that I felt was empowering to me.
Yeah, and I wanted to thank you because I called you desperate in January because I was writing a book, the book that became Raleigh Jefferson's Awesome Friendly Adventure, which is it's an adventure story, and it stars Roland the Kind. And I asked you for some guidance, and you talked to me about The Hobbit, and you gave me that bit of advice and more. So I wanted to say thank you for helping to shape that book. And speaking of books, in Kenny and the Book of Beasts, of course, a book it is kind of the main thing, right? There's this magical book that contains information and more on fantastical beasts. And I was wondering, in your real life, was there a book that you possessed as a kid, or maybe even held on to, that there's something about the physical book that feels magical to you?
Yeah, I have 2 of them.
All right.
Grab them.
And he's gone.
And I'm gone. I would have prepared.
Yeah. It looks like you've got your Tony DiTerlizzi. That must be from the Spiderwick set.
Yeah, it has a stuff.
Look, I've got my Wimpy Kid one over here.
Nice.
So
Wow.
I'm just going to pause on the awards, and we're back. Okay.
That's
all right. What do you got?
I like how it was the white with the black text because it fit the aesthetic. And the gothy, Okay, 2 books that really did change my life, and I got them both almost the same year. Yeah. This would be the first one. So Brian Froud.
I remember that one.
Alan Lee's Fairy book.
Yeah.
So Brian Froud would go on to work with Jim Henson and design The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, and Alan Lee would go on to design The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
So this book, and this is a clear-cut path to Spiderwick. Obviously, Spiderwick draws heavily upon this. We're huge fans of this book.
Aren't there also? Didn't he do Giants? And there was another one too. Did he do a Giants book?
Same editor, different artist. Brian only did this. Brian would come back and he did the Squashed Fairy book some years later, and he did a few. And then I think they've released now the Art of Crystal and the Art of Labyrinth and so on. But honestly, and the other one's going to come as no surprise to you. This is it, man. This is really pivotal.
Yeah.
I still have them to this day. The pictures I copied out of here when I was, 11, 12, 13 years old.
Wow. That's what's really interesting about that book. I'm experiencing this now because I have because I have this arcade machine where I can play old games that I played before.
Yeah.
In a way, it was like it's not that the artwork was so impressive. It's that the iconography is so strong. And like in that monster manual, like we could point to some pictures that aren't that good, right? And it's a terrible thing to say. But they nailed it somehow anyway. And it's sort of like there's something. I own that book as well, and then the books got more sophisticated and eventually ended up in your hands because you were doing the Loper and drawing things like that. But sure, I can't ask you to show any pictures that I'm saying are bad, but some of them are kind of childish, right? Like your 12-year-old.
No, I think
right.
Look, I think the one that comes to mind is probably one of the most iconic monsters of Dungeons and Dragons, the Beholder. I mean, look how
great. That's a great picture.
I mean, look how goofy it is, though.
It is goofy.
It's certainly not a video game.
Yeah.
scary. I mean, it's like a meatball with tentacles, and yet when we were kids, we were drawing it. And I would say that has had an impact on how you draw, you know, Greg and the cast of your characters. They're very iconic in their design. It's very memorable. It's like seeing Charlie Brown.
Okay.
You know, I mean, it's like you want to draw those characters, and you know, and they work for you because you can still get them to act and perform on the page and get the body language and the gags, and that's not always easy to do. Sometimes when you simplify a character to that kind of streamlined design, it can be really tricky to get them to like show emotion.
Yeah. So when I was a kid, I played Dungeons and Dragons. I only played successfully once, but it was enough to plant such a seed. Like I was with my friend. There was this, like, we were fifth graders. There was this senior in high school who was the babysitter that night, and he was going to be our dungeon master. It's like, dungeon master? Like, what is this? And so we made a character, and we had an adventure, and then like a guy came along in our party with us, and we were excited, and then he stole the map, right? And in fact, I used that idea for my rally book. But it's like, it's funny. It made such an imprint, and then all future games were basically my friend and I playing alone, and one of us doing a really bad job of being the dungeon master and being like, all right, you walk into the room and there's 5 orcs. It's like, I kill them. You know, it's like there's no story, no pacing. But now, is it true that you still play occasionally now?
We have. It's slowed down a little because of the pandemic, but yeah, we play at least once or twice a month, and we have a core group of people.
Yeah.
And you know, my daughter Soph plays, Angela, my wife, plays. Really good friends of ours, Scott Fisher, who's another artist, a friend of ours, Joe, whom we've known for years since we lived in New York, and another friend of ours, Chris, who's a child psychologist. Yeah. And so we've gone on a lot of adventures, and I've run a lot of the old adventures from the 80s that we would have played when we were kids, because I wanted to have Sophia experience those early adventures that I did. So we have like this thing that we can talk about.
Can you tell our audience, now, not everybody would have played Dungeons and Dragons, but can you tell the audience about the Tomb of Horrors module?
It's like a fun house. It's like, that's where you go if you just, the characters, it's how you were saying your guys were, if they were like, you know, I don't know, I kill it, I'm bored or whatever. I mean, that dungeon is meant for you to go in and for your players to never come out. That's what the adventure is designed for.
Yeah, so some people, you play that, that's like a legendary module where you get 5 feet in and everybody's impaled with spikes.
Yeah.
And that's the end, you know.
And then the hits just keep on coming. Yeah, that's a totally. Yeah. One of the ones that's really stuck with me though was, I don't know if you remember this one, and I don't know. Also, I would just sometimes just read the modules if I wasn't playing with friends. I would just read through those modules, and I would make my own maps and my own little adventures and stuff. But the one I loved was the Expedition to the Barrier Peaks.
I remember.
Do you know that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you go in and you're in a crashed UFO in Middle Earth. It was amazing.
That's really cool. Of course, we might have lost half the audience here, so let's pivot here. So one of the things I thought was really fun about Kenny and the Book of Beasts is that he inherits a bookstore. So the Burrow Bookshop, which looks like the ultimate bookstore, it's kind of got that whimsy and that magic to it. Here's a picture. And I was wondering if you could inherit, like if there was a business, a bookstore, anything that all of a sudden you got a certificate that says the owner, the proprietor has passed away, but they know how much you love this place and you inherit it. It's granted to you, Tony D. What would it be?
Wow. I think about the places I loved going to as a kid, and then the places I loved going to as a dad.
Yeah.
I think we love going to theme parks.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, who doesn't love going to Disney, any of those theme parks? We love going to museums. You know, we love the Eric Carle Museum here in Amherst. We love the Museum of Natural History. We actually did the thing where we did night at the museum down in New York. We actually spend the night in the museum, which sounds way cooler than it actually really is. There's really a bunch of people sleeping under the whale and people coughing in the middle of the night. And you're like, I'm trying to sleep.
Maybe not that. Maybe not the music.
Maybe not quite that much. Yeah. You know, I would love, you know, but I don't want to say. I don't want to say owning a bookstore because I know how much work that is. You know what I mean? And I don't mean that in a dismissive way. I mean that I'm acknowledging that, like, it's really tricky to get people, especially young, you know, to get kids excited about reading.
Yeah.
You almost have to lean on the adults in their life to get them and, you know, bring them into the shop and have events where, you know, maybe an author or an illustrator comes to their school, somebody they've never, you know, interacted with before. And that's, you know, that's not always easy to do.
You're right. It's not. And sometimes you have to read their books. It's crazy. So let's talk about, you know what? I know a lot of people are getting quite a kick out of seeing our two faces just communicating with one another. But what would be even more fun is for them to see my face and your computer screen. Can you draw while we talk?
I would love to do that. Let me see my old.
So I'm going to ask you while you figure that out. I'm really interested in this idea of magic. In Spiderwick, I remember that Spiderwick really was about the idea that there's magic in our world, but you just have to know where to look. And this kind of goes with what we're talking about, is that you somehow can play Dungeons and Dragons now as an adult and get rid of that. You're able to play and use your imagination and be fully present for it. That would be really hard for me now. I'm wondering, where do you find magic in this world? As you're showing us the model sheet for, I know I'm taking you totally off your game.
No. Where do I find? I find, look, I mean, look, let's be honest. I mean, as an adult, sometimes it's very hard to find magic in the world with the news and the way the things are right now. But I still find it when I spend time, not just with my daughter, but with kids and messing around with them and talking to them and entertaining them and being goofy with them and with you, who I feel probably has more imagination than you realize, and just feeling and being, remembering the things that you loved as a kid and holding on to those things. I mean, Jeff, you and I have talked so much about how much the music that we grew up with, how much we love it. Yeah. And I think that's part of it. And I think, you know, it's like how people are into Star Wars or into, you know, Marvel superheroes or things like that. I think all that stuff is where I still find magic. I still feel it when I watch, you know, Game of Thrones and I see a princess flying on a dragon, maybe burning people to ash, but
spoiler alert. All right, tell me what we're looking at here.
What we're looking at is, you know, I started this about 10 years. It took me a while to figure this out, and I learned a lot of it on Spiderwick. Was that my drawings of characters could be inconsistent. I worked primarily on gesture, and I needed to work on more closely on actual construction, which I suspect you probably know this already. But for in the last, like I said, about 10 years, I've started making these model sheets, which are basically cheat sheets for me to know how to draw these characters and try to be able to draw them consistently throughout a story. So it's a part me learning how to draw them, and then it's also part me remembering notes and things like this. Mm-hmm. So I just remember them as I'm working on it. And then it's also kind of almost like an animator, kind of breaking down these designs into simple shapes, because I really do have to teach myself how to draw them. And then you kind of draw them for 6 months or however long I'm working on a book, and then you move on to the next book, and then you may not, you know, draw these characters again for, in this case, 10 years. Yeah. So understanding these kind of things can help me down the road when I'm like, all right, well, I need to draw, Graham here, and he needs to be kind of, looking up. So now I've got kind of a way to kind of, I've got something that's going to help me, do that.
Yeah.
And so this is just one of the model sheets that I used. In particular, the thing I like was this one actually has this kind of this motion, this calligraphy kind of the shapes of Graham.
Yeah.
That I kind of used. And so I'll do a very quick run through of how I did it. And I know you guys are recording this and stuff, which is great. So if anybody wants to join along, this is where you'd hit pause and grab a piece of paper and a pencil and an eraser. But I'll kind of run quickly, Jeff, through how I came to do it on this one. And it just started with a square, which you kind of saw. And I think to this point, people are always like, I can't draw a straight line, and you can see here, neither can I. I mean, as you probably do you work in Illustrator when you're illustrating?
I work in Animate, so it's sort of like Illustrator. Yeah.
Wow. So it's vector based.
Yep, vector based.
Okay, so it's a little different than Photoshop, which is pixel based.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm gonna just divide this square in half and in half, and then I'm gonna divide this part here in half again, and I'm going to use these kind of guidelines to kind of help me draw Graham's profile. I'm going to draw another guideline that's going to go from here to here.
Okay.
So I'll do that really quick. So this thing that looks vaguely like origami instructions is actually how I draw Graham. I do a letter, like kind of a squished letter C for his nose. Kind of connects here. And then I can continue some of these guidelines that are going to help me later. I'm going to find the middle of that C, which is about right there.
Yep.
Oops. Let me do a redo on that. Whack. Put it there. And then I'm going to put a line there. I'm going to connect this kind of like with a half pipe shape.
Yep. And
do some eyebrows. And then where all these points intersect, that's right where I'm going to do the lens of his eye. And then the V here for his lids. And then I'll do, I'll continue this shape for, for his eyelid and some crow's feet, which I now have. You can kind of get the lens. So you can see like quickly kind of building, the beginnings of his face. His nose is going to come off this center line off the square. And he's got kind of a cat nose. So, you figure you got reptilian dragons. You have, in How to Train Your Dragon, I think Hiccup's dragon. I can't remember what his name was. He's very cat-like in that his dragon that he had at least in the film.
Yeah.
Graham is kind of a mixture of cat and goat. It's very goat-like. So he has a mouth though like a T-Rex. So it actually comes down and then it comes back up right here. But he's very kind of gruff and kind of shaggy.
Yeah.
But then he has the lips here like a cat, and then the whiskers, and then as per my note, he's got like a mustache that kind of come off. I follow this line here right to here, and I use that as the bottom of his jaw, and then I use this angled line as my guide for his horns here, which are kind of like goat or ram horns, and then I kind of square them off. Now it's funny because if it was Spiderwick, they'd come to a point. It's a more it would be more like, it's more of a barbed, it's a different story, but, Graham isn't that kind of dragon, and this isn't that kind of story. So those are kind of the decisions aesthetically that I try to make and use the visual language to convey that tone of the story, which, it's taken me 20 years to probably figure out.
We've talked a little bit about video games here. I think my favorite type of art of all time was Atari cartridges, right? Because Atari 2600 cartridges, because, and this is something for the kids back home, is that we used to have games where, in fact, there was a game called Adventure, where you're a knight you're in a castle and there's dragons, and then you have a sword, and literally in the game,
this was you, right? This was you were a knight, and that, by the way, is your sword.
Right. Now, do you remember what a dragon looked like in that game?
It was kind of like, let me see if I can draw it. I mean, it would be all 8-bit. I remember it being kind of
no curves, but you're good. You're getting there. I'm gonna pull it up.
And then when you were in his belly, you were like this, right? It was really, it was like, it was like a weird duck.
Yeah. In fact, I found. Yeah. Here's several dragons. That's what the dragons look like, right? And then the cartridges would like, it was really exciting. In fact, this isn't one of the better versions, but that's the cartridge for that game. And they would totally oversell it. Like you would see that art and you'd be like, I have to have this game. And then you'd get it and it was like, you're a square, you're just a square.
But still, like adventure, I still loved it. My imagination could fill in the blanks on that one.
Right.
To be honest with you.
Yeah. So Tony, here's what we're gonna do. While you continue to draw, and I know we're missing out on your instruction now, but there are some questions, so we're gonna pepper some in.
Yeah.
Tim or Cassie, why don't you give us the third most liked question?
All right. This one's from Jennifer. Do you find characteristics in people that would make good characters in your book? And do you use them? And furthermore, do you tell them you use them?
That is a terrific question. I would say they're pieces of me. I would say I definitely kind of get fragmented, and I use fragments of me for a lot of the characters. Certainly Kenny Rabbit is partly me, but I think there's definitely part of me that's also Graham the Dragon. I do think it starts there, and then they kind of get, I grow them out. I don't know if you have this, Jeff, but I try to find a voice in my head, and sometimes it's an actor or it's a character from a show or a book or whatever, and I use that as my go-to for it. So for instance, Graham had this very old, kind of very British, oh yes, creme brulee, I'd love some creme brulee. He's very kind of, that kind of, wasn't fussy, but he just very old kind of, but then could be very high pitched when he wanted to.
Yeah.
So when I'm writing, I'm actually, down here kind of, saying all these words out loud to myself while I'm working to try to figure out exactly what they'd say or how they say it. I do a lot of editing out loud. I'm reading out loud constantly. And Kenny would be like, hey, like, hi, which is me when I was, in grade. It was totally me.
And let's talk about that for a second. Is that one of the things that you talk about in the new book is how you have to say goodbye to some things, and I think there's, the idea is that a change is hard and you have to accept it. I was just curious about what types of things you miss from your childhood that you think were better than things now, and that that you had to say goodbye to.
I think about this question a lot, Jeff. I think especially as a parent, as a person who's making books for kids to hopefully, as I said, kind of entertain them. I think about and I don't know if you know this story about where Spiderwick kind of came from, but I was about 12 years old, living down in Florida. I think I've told this story at your store before when I did an event, and I again was hopped up on the D&D, the Monster Manual, and the Brian Froud's fairies book, and I had all that stuff on my mind, all those fairies and the D&D monsters on my mind, and I had been a Boy Scout for many years up to that. Yeah, I was a real lady killer. And I remember spending a summer and having my old my old school supplies, including my Trapper Keeper with all and it had extra paper in it, and I kind of used my field guides from Boy Scouts, kind of mesh them with the D&D Monster Manual and Brian Froud's Fairies, and kind of that's how I came up with what would become the Spiderwick Field Guide. But the real the spark that really made all that stuff happen was being in my room, being bored.
Yeah.
I mean, being bored for a serious amount of time, just kind of like, I don't know what I'm going to do because I'm so bored. And then finally kind of, coming up with something to entertain myself. And I'm worried, Jeff, that kids don't get a chance to be as bored today than we did when we were younger, because there's most likely they have a TV in the room, and if they don't have a TV, they may have a computer. I mean, the computer may be for school, and so you've got a TV in your room. You might have a laptop in your room. A lot of kids now have devices in their rooms. Other kids may have I'm going to draw it wrong, but it's the symbol for video games as well. I mean, there's so many things that are cool things, and I love all those things too, but it all is vying for your attention, and I don't know if it allows us to be bored as much as it used to be. And I get a little worried about that. Yeah,
I was thinking about, I remember when I downloaded my first digital song, and the way that it happened was I thought of a song I wanted to hear, and I typed it in, and then the song came up and I could play it. And I was like, oh, wow, life will never get, like, music acquisition will never get better than that, right? Because it's unless I had a chip implanted in my brain, right? But I know this is making me sound old. It was better because you would go to the record store. There was an anticipation. You knew that the album was coming out. You would hear what the clerk was playing overhead. Maybe you discover some new music. There's a tactile, a physical part to it where you're flipping through the albums. The album art was really big. And in fact, even though it was so much less convenient to get music, it was so much better as an experience, So I think that's something that's being lost.
Listen, I think that I don't think that should be just a simple thing that's dismissed from our generation, because those albums that came out in the 60s before we were born, or right as we were being born, and through the 70s and the 80s, an album was like an experience. I mean, especially as you grew to appreciate the music. I know for me, it started with, my parents loved the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and all that stuff, and I would listen to that. And then I remember putting on, a Pink Floyd album or an Elton John album or whoever, you were listening to. You put on the big giant headphones, you'd open up, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, and you went on this auditory journey, and you had pictures and lyrics, and it just made the whole thing more profound of an experience. I just want to hear that one. You don't even need to, you just say it to your phone. You just say, if you don't know the song, your phone will tell you what the song is. Play that. I want to hear that.
Yeah. And mostly it's just to remember what it felt like then. Tell me that. Okay, Kim or Cassie, I'm sorry, is Cassie, why don't you, I told you we do audience questions and we've only done one. So let's do 3 in a row.
Okay.
But
I have to say,
go ahead.
Tony, your wife is cracking me up on Facebook right now. She's very active on this live stream, and it's hilarious. All right.
Expect nothing less from her.
How cool was it illustrating Dungeons and Dragons, and how did that come about?
Great question. I graduated art school, and I went to art school in Florida. I grew up in South Florida, and I knew I'd wanted to do children's books. I had a portfolio of samples to send to children's books and to editorial illustration, because in the early 90s and late 80s, there was artwork in Rolling Stone and Entertainment Weekly. They used artwork all the time, and I never got to do any of that art. And submitting my artwork remotely from Florida wasn't going to break me into the children's book industry. So I moved back home and started playing Dungeons and Dragons with some of my old friends. And at their encouragement, I submitted samples to TSR, which was the original publisher for Dungeons and Dragons. And it took a while. That's the other thing. I mean, I remember sending the samples in, getting rejected, but they had at least replied with a letter. It's like, nice samples, keep us up to date on whatever you're doing. And I kept sending them samples over the course of a year. And by the end of that year, they gave me work. And with each submission, I think I began to understand more and more what the game was about. And it wasn't just drawing beholders and dragons and wizards and knights. It was about like, what does their landscape look like? What does the ruins look like that they're exploring? What are the magic items that they might find? What does their armor look like? How does it work? And what I didn't realize in the 10 years that I illustrated for Dungeons and Dragons was I was learning all the nuts and bolts of world building and how to successfully construct an imagined world. So I think I was definitely in over my head when I first started working for them, but I came out much more of a stronger visual storyteller for sure. And you can see its effect on Spiderwick, those Wandla books that I did right after Spiderwick, and even in Kenny and the Dragon, when there's specifically probably the second one where there's a magic system that's involved. So when you create magic, and now you know this, Jeff, working with the Rolly Adventures, when you create a magic system, you have to have rules that set up some kind of logic and structure within the story, and then of course, so you can subvert those rules at some point in the story. Yeah. And that's hard stuff. It's hard to figure all that stuff out. It's tricky.
Yeah. Okay, Cassie, what's next?
Someone on your Facebook feed really wants you two to do a Dungeons and Dragons one-off and stream it. And I'm so for it. That sounds great.
I would totally DM you and run you through an adventure.
Is that a verb?
What's that?
Is that a verb? It sounds like a threat that you're going to DM me. I don't want. I'm afraid.
DM'd.
I want witnesses. How about Angela, who's watching? I would like to know what animal she thinks that Tony is.
Oh, that's good.
We'll wait for it to come on Facebook. All right. And question for you, Tony.
Yeah.
Are you a frequenter of Renaissance festivals?
We do. Actually, King Richard's, which isn't too far from you, Jeff.
That's right.
We've gone to a couple of times. Now, I am lousy. I will literally just wear like a D&D t-shirt and like a cape with like a cheesy Halloween horn helmet, and I'll just have such a blast eating the food and watching all the shows. So my dress-up game is lousy. I don't look very convincing. I look more like a bad time traveler than I do, a member of the community. I sure do have fun. I love going to a Ren Fair. How about you?
I'm more rigid and uncomfortable than you are in that environment. But I do like the turkey leg. It's the only place I've ever had the turkey leg, and it just seems like why don't we eat this all the time? You feel like you're really in the act of eating. Like this is how eating should be always for every food.
You just saw like a wiffle bat leg, like yeah, it's good. You feel like man, eat. Yeah.
Cassie, give us another question.
How did your exhibition at the Norman Rockwell Museum happen, and how long did it take to put together?
Oh wow. The exhibition was it was a kind of a conversation I've been having with the curator, Jesse Kowalski, who had just come on at the Rockwell Museum, and the folks at the museum were thinking of could we bring in some more contemporary illustrators to hang? And I had been approached by another museum, not the Eric Carle Museum, but another museum, about hanging a retrospective. And I wasn't sure when to give him an answer. And my wife, Angela, was like, well, why don't you want to do this? It sounds like an amazing opportunity. And I said, I've always dreamed that one day, if I could hang in any museum, it would be the Norman Rockwell Museum, because Norman Rockwell was such a huge impact on me as an artist. And she's like, well, do they know that? Maybe you should reach out to them and see if they would respond. So I just went for it. I sent him an email and just said, I'm a huge fan. I know I'm probably not worthy, but it would be amazing to talk about some kind of exhibition. And I'd had an amazing exhibition of Spiderwick at the Eric Carle Museum. I curated an exhibition at the Eric Carle Museum, and they are terrific in focusing on picture books and children's book illustration. But I wanted to be able to show my Magic the Gathering art, my Dungeons and Dragons art, a lot of the other art that was so impactful on me in my career. And, it was kind of a nothing venture, nothing gained. I mean, most of the times when I ask for stuff like that, the answer is no. And this was one of the few times in my life where they were like, we were thinking of you. We've been talking about you, and we would love to work with you. And it took a geez, I want to say over a year to kind of get it all together, because it's easier said than done. But it was a real honor for me to be able to work with Jesse and the staff and put that exhibition together, and to see the Dungeons and Dragons and the magic art, and actually to see all, it's almost like being turned inside out, Jeff. It was a strange feeling to see all of that, but I had a couple of goals that really were what was driving it, and it wasn't about seeing my work in a museum. It was I wanted a young artist, a kid, an adult who's just trying out, to see the path that I took and see that it could be achieved. That I wasn't born with some magical power, that it was a lot like I just loved to draw and I just never stopped drawing. So I was very implicit that I'm like, I want to show artwork I did when I was a kid. I want to show drawings that were not so great, that where I'm learning and trying to figure out the process. And I want to show how I do it. I want to, I walk in and I look at a Norman Rockwell painting and I'm like, I am never going to be able to do that because I don't understand his oil painting process. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to show, here's how I did some of the art. Let's break it down into pieces and show you. And I wanted to do, they did a terrific part of the exhibition where we showed, here's all the artists that I looked at, and I'm going to show you that piece, and I'm going to show you my piece where you can see the correlation, or the theft, whatever you want to call it. You can see exactly where I'm looking at different artists for inspiration. To really demystify it a little bit. That was the thing that meant the most to me.
That's cool. And Angela says a bear, Winnie the Pooh, he loves to eat and hibernate. And so, Angela, I'm waiting to know what animal I would be naturally. And then let's do one more question, Cassie. What's your very best?
All right. If you and Jeff were to write a book together, what would it be about?
Wow.
That would be interesting. Maybe the Rally book in a way, because it's fantasy. It's our two interests, right?
Yeah.
But I did that all by myself, just saying.
Yeah. It'd be amazing to team up and to illustrate. I mean, I've drawn pictures of Greg and Ralph and sent them to you before, but it would be interesting to see what would happen when you mesh.
Yeah.
I loved that when I worked with Mo. It was a really cool experience, not just in the end book that we created, but just the process of making something together.
Yeah.
It was very memorable. I'd like to think Mo felt the same way. I mean, we're still friends, so I'm guessing it went well for him too. But that was the part that really drew me in. It was like just the idea of like philosophically where you come from. I have a little bit of an idea because you and I have talked about it.
Yeah.
But it'd be interesting. Have you ever thought about that? I'm sure you must get approached by other people. Hey, let's team you up with, blah, blah, blah.
I have thought about it from time to time, and that would be fun to team up. I've also worried, like, I don't know, like who. Yeah, I don't know if can two people come into something equally. You've had experiences with this, I haven't, and exit equally. Like, or does one person need to be the dominant? Like, do you need to come up with an arrangement when you start and say, let's come in as equals, but I'm going to make the final call, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know how you litigate if there's a disagreement, and that's what would stop me up. And it's not just from working with you; it's sort of anybody, right? Because I just don't know how that goes, So it's an interesting thought.
I think it all comes down to communication, and I think if you blindly put two people together, that's probably riskier. And that's how publishing is generally done. Usually, the author and the illustrator often don't even communicate at all. It's usually gone straight through the publisher. I think, when I worked with Holly and I had been friends for many years before we worked on Spiderwick, so there was really good communication throughout it. And I think that in many ways was riskier because the lines were so blurred. I mean, we were plotting those stories together, and I was showing her all the art. I'm like, do the Grace kids look like this, or do they look like this? What about this? What do you think of this? And I wanted her input because we wanted that text and that art to be so dovetailed tight. Right. I think when I worked with Mo, I mean, basically what we did was we kind of offered you could get a round of feedback and notes on each other's contributions.
Yeah, yeah.
And at the end of the day, you know, you go off and be the writer, and the other person would go off and be the illustrator. And I think it was good because I felt like you're holding back on helping the book if you're like, well, my role is only to do this. But your toolkit, you know, you're writing and illustrating. You know how to do that, you know. So I think it's keeping the communication. I could see the worry and the risk, and you know, maybe I'm being naive, but I think it really comes down to communication.
Yeah. So
setting expectations from the beginning.
Yeah, we're going to rapid fire, clear out the right-hand side. We've got, Diane was appreciative of you giving insight into your process. Linda, how long have Tony and I known each other? I'd say about 6 or 7 years, and I don't remember how we first met, but you've come to my bookstore a few times.
Yeah, I have memories of you during peak Spiderwick at like National Book Festival.
Oh yeah. We must have met there. Yeah, and then you invited us to your place, and we played video games, and I think ate pizza. Fortnite, Tony DiTerlizzi, yes or no?
I'm not Fortnite. No, I wish I haven't had time.
Yeah,
it's a huge time suck. I wish I had the time, but I don't.
And I went through a Fortnite phase, a long one. Angela says I'd be a seal. I think I can live with that. No chin. And Marie recommends that we need a story moderator. So segue into me being the moderator here. It is time for us to close up shop. Can't recommend enough these 2 books. Don't just get one. They belong together. So please, they're awesome. Tony, thank you very much for giving us a peek into your imagination and spending time with us and supporting an independent bookstore. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I wish we could be doing it in person, but I'm happy to do it via Zoom.
Yeah.
And you guys are amazing. I hope you're all doing well. Hang in there. I'm looking forward to a time when we are all together, and maybe we'll play some D&D.
Yeah, I can't wait till you DM me in person, whatever that means. All right, Cassie.
Thank you guys so much. Buy the book, click that blinking green button at the bottom of your screen, and when you buy it today, you're going to get a signed book plate, and it's beautiful. It's got Kenny Rabbit on it. It's gorgeous. So click that link, and you're supporting a small independent bookstore and Tony DiTerlizzi. Thank you guys so much.
All right, thanks. See ya.
Thank you.